Welcome to the panel session. It seems to me I was the chair without even realising it, but why not? Why not indeed? Actually, I don't need to chair such professional colleagues, and a chance to make some comments on the end of what has been an excellent day, trying to understand where we go with data and what we've learned from the data limitations that we have and the challenges we face as a country, but also internationally. We have a chance, I think, ultimately to promote international excellence in what we do, not only with the ONS, but with the plans for developing our understanding of an advanced economy at this time. So I'm very glad today to be joined. I'm Jagjit, Chadha, the Director of the National Institute of Economic Social Research, John Aston from University of Cambridge, Sam Beckett from BEIS, and Michael Keoghan from BEIS as well. I think I've been asked to make some very brief comments summarising some of the issues. If I get this wrong, just someone tell me to shut up, but I'll try and do a couple of minutes. And I think the order is Sam, John, and then Mike. Is that acceptable to everyone? Would that be okay? So I think where we are, and I've really enjoyed thinking about the issues raised by the papers today and the discussion. I think we've got lots of time for Q&A. So we'll all sort of maybe talk for 4 or 5 minutes and then go to the take questions from the floor. So do send them into the Q&A or directly into the chat, and we'll try to answer them as we go along. As is usual for these events, the greatest shame of all in my mind is that we're not all together somewhere. I shan't say at BEIS, I'm not sure that is where I want to be, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, but we're all together somewhere talking personally with each other about these issues. But we are where we are in terms of the lockdown, the constraints that faces our activity, and I think many of us have worked manfully and womanfully in this period to carry on with our work. So just when you do send your question, just tell us who you are and your affiliation, and that can help the dialogue, I think, a little bit better. So sort of gather your thoughts. The economy, as we now all know, has suffered what can only be described as the kind of volatility that nobody would have anticipated a couple of years ago. We were trained on trying to deliver Brexit as a nation. That was a low-level kind of uncertainty that was persistent and enduring in the economy. And then we found ourselves, as we were coming out of that period, this enormous shock to the standard patterns and ways that we do things. Our modus operandi was disrupted in a way that no one I know has lived through in their adult life, can only be comparable in some sense to what might happen in all conditions. And as a result, as a result of the rapid spread pandemic, the government rightly introduced a series of lockdowns to try and contain the impact on the health sector and try to limit the number of deaths in the economy and prevent an overload of the health sector. And I think that was the main objective of policy in that period. And to support that, of course, what we had was supportive expansionary monetary and fiscal policy to try and limit the impact overall on incomes and activity in the economy. And we've seen the kind of support, again, we might not envisage. And for those of us that follow these things, as a result of that, debt levels have escalated, interest rates are as low as they've ever been in our lifetimes. And the government, or rather the Bank of England, has embarked on a further round of quantitative easing, holding some up to 40% of outstanding government. But nevertheless, last year there was a huge contraction in activity, and one of the largest contractions that we might have expected to see in the advanced economies. We're beginning to understand the reasons for that. We haven't got a full story for it, but clearly our economy in terms of its health was more profoundly affected than other advanced economies. Very sadly, our death rate was relatively high when we compare it to other advanced economies. I think that contributed to the slowdown that we see. We have an economy which is very much concentrated in the area of social consumption. That then means that because lockdowns limit social consumption, you see more of a fall than you would otherwise see. And of course, as an intensely global and open economy, what happens in the rest of the world also drives the UK on the margin quite extensively. So we're seeing the impact as well on the economy. So what have we learned in this process, and where do we want to drive the debate now? Well, I think we've learned something I think we all knew all along, that the public sector matters, really matters, to be able to deliver health services, to deliver education where we can, to think about infrastructure and think about pockets of regional demand that will sustain activity in the long run. We've also learned that levels matter, for which I mean the level of income, the level of social well-being, not the change. Concentrating on change, I think, is highly misleading as an idea. So we need to think a little bit more in terms of levels and move the narrative to that. Clearly, and the Statistical Office, the ONS, along with its R&D organisation, ESCoE, which we're very glad to host at the National Institute, is focused very much on accurate measurement. We need to know, as well as we can, the state of the nation. That doesn't just mean GDP, it means all the components and all the things that are associated with it, we might not measure very well. And part of that as well is more emphasis on the decomposition of that at the regional and sectoral level. It's not enough to look at the headline. One of the things that's becoming very clear, and I make no normative statement aside, it's simply descriptive, that this shock has been one that has widened inequalities. Many people with better initial conditions, either in terms of education or wealth, have done better than they might have anticipated in the last year. And those with less well-off initial conditions have done worse. And we see worrying increases in destitution, poverty in many parts of the country. We've also, and I think the ONS has done a grand job here, delivered data much faster than we might have in the past. That is of help. But let me go to some caveats on that. Delivering faster data is by itself not necessarily helpful. We're not providing data as a public service just for shelf stacking for the private sector. It's actually about policy, making decisions under tremendous uncertainty as to what we can do to alleviate the problems the public and society are facing. And that requires a different approach than just thinking, let's just track the next mobility indicator or the number of flights coming in and out. It's got to be driven towards better policy. And that must be our objective in collecting data. Cannot be just, and I'm a great fan of the private sector, but it cannot be just for the demands of the private sector, market participants, and other types of people. And so what we need is a structure that avoids double counting. The great thing about an economic structure is we're able to understand whether bits of information are indeed new or novel, or in fact just looking at something from the same perspective. If you count the number of eggs being laid in a day and the number of chickens, you've got two different bits of data, but they're not necessarily telling you different things about egg production. And in that same way, if we're measuring mobility and we're measuring the number of trips to restaurants, we may not be getting more information on how the economy is really working. And what that therefore needs, I think, as well as everything else, is not only an economic structure that allows us to absorb this information, but more statements from our national statistical offices about the uncertainty of any measure. We used to teach our undergraduates that GDP was measured in three distinct stages, a first release, a second release, and a final release. In all of that, there's uncertainty in what the final number will mean. We don't know what the final number is on anything to do with 2020, it seems to me, certainly on 2021. And where we want guidance is to how certain we can be about any bit of data that comes our way. And that's something I would very much encourage our statistical officers to think more about in conjunction with our excellent academic sector and our policymakers. But ultimately, as someone intensely interested in policy, what we need is to allow the statistical offices to develop narratives about what's going on so we can plan and develop better policy. I think that's almost certainly enough from me. If I could, in the first instance, perhaps turn to Sam to add or take away from those comments as she may wish. Sam.
Lovely, thank you, Jag. I hope that you can hear me okay. So I'm Sam Beckett. I'm second Perm Sec at the Office for National Statistics, and I'm also co-head of the Government Economic Service with my friend Claire Lombardelli from the Treasury. But it's a pleasure to come and join the panel today to talk about this burning topic of data during the pandemic and what we've learnt. I think my title for the few points that I'd like to make to kick off are really 6 points on how the Office for National Statistics survived the pandemic and why there's no turning back. So I shall try and keep it brief. The first one, I think Jagjit alluded to, that was about timeliness. We had learned the lessons of the financial crisis at the Office for National Statistics. In the financial crisis, we missed the economic turning point. We've been very transparent about that. And that was really bad for kind of managing the economy. If we hadn't learned from it, though, I think it would have made us irrelevant. So it's incredibly important, and it was incredibly prescient for the ONS to really invest in this area. And the story there is one of moving to the monthly publication of GDP. So in 2008, we didn't report that the economy was shrinking until October 2008. That was about 4 months after the end of the quarter in which the downturn began. So in 2020, we were able to say that the economy had shrunk in mid-April, which was 6 weeks after the end of the month in which it happened. So, it was just a massive shift in timeliness from 4 months after the end of the quarter to 6 weeks after the end of the month. And that's been a real transformative change. Second point, we very quickly moved to create new surveys and adapt existing ones to the challenges of the pandemic. Obviously, the COVID infection survey, that's the big one. 4 million swabs have been taken by ONS on people's doorsteps. Quite an extraordinary line of work for us to get into, I think, in many ways. 220 odd thousand households have responded. It has been a massive and a complete expansion into a very different area of work for the ONS. So that's the big one. But we also, within a few weeks, had the business impacts of coronavirus up and running, a fortnightly UK-wide survey of businesses, with a 2-week turnaround, bringing insights to relevant policy questions within a couple of weeks. And that is something that I think is here to stay. As I say, the no turning back point is in the forefront of my mind. We've adapted it to ask questions about the end of the transition period and net zero, and and departments are queuing up to put questions into that survey. Opinions and lifestyle, that was one that was out there, but we made it weekly, and that has been a really important social complement to the business survey. Third point, the acceleration in the use of admin data. Here I think it's the labour market story that I would pick out. The labour force survey, face-to-face, gets shifted to telephone, and the response characteristics are different, and we've increasingly learned that, and we are still learning. But what has saved us is our investment in HMRC's payroll data. In terms of the sample size, you've got 29 million people in payroll compared to the 82,000 of the labour force survey, and we've invested in that. We've got more timely results, we've got more granular by geographies, by sector, and that has really kept the story of the labour market accurate and up and running over this very challenging time for our traditional survey. Fourth point, and I can see, we've talked about this a lot today, but it has been that massive explosion in real-time indicators. I would pick this, so rather than go through the list of all the weird and wonderful things we can now tell you, from restaurant bookings to traffic around ports, I think the consideration here that's on my mind is the use of commercial data for kind of official time series. First of all, what's noise and what's a reliable indicator, as Jagjit was saying earlier, but what are the implications of commercial providers? For them, is it a commercial advantage? Is it a commercial disadvantage? And sometimes they don't know, and we see that in their kind of behaviours in terms of their willingness to supply. And what are the implications for us, the kind of security of supply, if we come to rely on commercial services, but that is under a time-limited contract arrangement, or really just under a kind of cooperative agreement. So lots of issues there that I think we need to think about as we become more and more reliant on the faster indicators suite from commercial services. Just a couple more final points. One is the data linkage story, definitely. The ONS has stepped up to advertise itself as the data partner of government and beyond through the integrated data programme. It's a key plank of the national data strategy. We're creating the platform and the architecture for safe data linking, and so there's no turning back on that. That's a massive step forward for ONS. Finally, more inclusive data. The ONS has launched the Inclusive Data Task Force. I think the pandemic has shone a spotlight on many inadequacies of the way we measure the economy and society. We'll get the task force report soon. You know, it will cast a light on undermeasured areas of society, children, people not living in a household unit. But I think it's another way in which you know, we've responded during the pandemic to something that has become more highlighted through the pandemic, and that we're better as a result, and there's no turning back. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Sam. I should have introduced you properly as the Acting Permanent Secretary of BEIS, and thank you for spending time. I just absolutely understand how intensely busy you've been as a department, but also personally in the last year and a half, and I'm very grateful you've been able to join us and go through what is such an impressive list of achievements at this difficult time. If I may now, I'd like to turn to John Aston, who's a Harding Professor of Statistics in Public Life at the University of Cambridge, for his perspective as one of the country's leading statisticians. John.
Thank you very much, Jagjit. So, I mean, my perspective is that from a data point of view, we are going through a complete change of how data is being used, and we've seen in COVID that it can be used in a different way. And as Sam and Jagjit have both said, it's about building from there and not going back to how we were in the past. So in addition to now being a statistician in Cambridge, I was the CSA at the Home Office for a number of years until till the end of last year. And I think I really saw a sea change there in how data was being used. And I think that COVID has only increased that across government. I think one of the things that we've seen with COVID that I think is a really important factor is that it's all types of data that's needed. It's not any one individual piece of data that's going to be the really driving force. It's about how we take lots of different data from lots of different places and bring it together and create a narrative that takes it all into account. We've seen that we need lots and lots of quantitative data. We need lots of modeling associated with that, and then really bring that modeling together to get a bigger picture. Or a more granular picture, depending on what we can use that data for. But we also need to combine that with qualitative data to really understand some of the parts that are very difficult to measure. I think we've seen that in some of the narrative around what I believe is a false dichotomy between health and the economy. I think that there is actually bringing that to data gives a much more nuanced understanding of the interplay between some of the decisions made around health and some of the decisions that were made in the economy, and how we can bring all that together. And I think that's only going to be true as we go forward from here, coming out of COVID, where we're going to have to make lots of decisions which are going to have many, many different facets to them, some of which will seem in tension and others which will actually need to be brought together to understand how we can actually benefit on both sides. I think that really does sort of bring, and we've seen lots of the questions around real-time indicators, about how we're prepared to use real-time data and then sort of some of the more classic but potentially more robust indicators and data that we have. I think there is not necessarily a trade-off always between fast real-time data and quality of data, but sometimes there is. And I think we should be happy that sometimes we're going to want to use really well-defined gold standard national statistics, and other times we will be happy that experimental data can tell us something, but we need to understand the caveats around that. So a number of people have talked about the labour market, and I think as we come out of COVID, that's going to obviously be critical. We are going to need to understand the labour market in many different ways, on sectors, geography, as well as the sort of headlines. And we are, Sam talked about the fact that one of the real benefits is that being able to link ONS and HMRC data, but it's going to have to go wider than that. It's going to have to bring in data from the Home Office, data from BEIS, into one big understanding of what's actually happening with the labour market, what's driving the labour market, what are some of the questions that the labour market is going to that's going to come up coming from here. That's going to be about understanding what the data is, but it's also going to be understanding about how that data links into the questions that policy wants to answer, and what questions policy will have to answer that may be not obvious until you actually dig down into the data and see what is happening. So I think there is a real, I think it's been brilliant the way that we've seen that data linkage can happen. but there's also now going to be this sort of imperative that it has to happen. And I think one of the questions is about the fact that, what are people going to need to do in future? Well, they're going to have to demand that they actually have that data to link together, because otherwise they'll go back to this, well, do we need these individual data sets? No, we actually need them brought together. From a sort of academic point of view, what do I think are the biggest challenges that we need to bring to the table? Well, we need to really help people with data literacy. I think it's not about simply the analysts being the only people who can look at data. They have an incredibly important job to do, doing the best data analysis, the most sophisticated data analysis that can be done here with the data that we have available. But every policy maker, every person making decisions is going to need to have a level of data literacy that goes beyond what some of them have now. And I think we need to really try and build that up, because I think that will help people really understand what they're getting. And that comes to some of the questions around uncertainty. How do we communicate uncertainty? We all have to become better at communicating uncertainty, and also potentially living with uncertainty, and saying that in actual fact, as we get more data, that doesn't always necessarily give us a more definitive answer. It actually illustrates that we do know, in some sense, more uncertainty about what we're going. Now, for me as a statistician, I'm quite comfortable with the fact that I'd actually like to understand what the true uncertainty is, rather than be overly certain about something that is actually much more uncertain than I realize. So I think really understanding how we can build that communication into the work we do around data, not just saying it's about us making sure we're linking the data together, we're getting the right things at the right time, but also really making sure that we are communicating about that data in a way that makes it easy to understand, and easy to understand what we don't know about the data as well.
Thank you very much, John. It's a comprehensive survey of the issues that we face in terms of both public understanding, but also kind of communicating where we are on things in a manner that can be absorbed by policymakers and the public in general. Before turning to Mike Keoghan, who's the Chief Economic Advisor at BEIS, let me apologise to Sam Beckett, who is the Second Permanent Secretary at ONS rather than her previous role at BEIS. I got any excuses. The last year and a half has flown by, and the last time we met, you were at BEIS, and it's very hard to keep track of these things. So my congratulations for moving to ONS. I got that wrong, but those who know me are used to me getting things wrong. Mike, if I may turn to you.
Well, I also got one wrong. I'm meant to be chairing this, it turns out. So, but you're doing it great. So I'll keep on deferring. So look, there's five things I think just to kind of play back. One is, it is really important to realize how far we've come. I remember working in the DTI on the Asian crisis. And when we were looking for the real-time data, we were huddled around a television set watching CFAX feed from the BBC flick over. For the younger viewers, you might want to Google what that is, but that was our real-time indicator. That's how we monitored what was happening. And by 2007, obviously, and 2008 and the great financial crisis, we had the internet, we could see what's going on. But even then, often we were, looking below the line for stories to think about what people were commenting on, to try and get some insight as to what was happening. And if you compare that to what happened, into the pandemic, where we genuinely did have, albeit very noisy, but data of what was happening. I mentioned earlier on in the day, looking at the Google Trends search for laid off, and the fact that you just saw it rocket, and then furloughs announced and it goes down. So you could see the fear in the economy, and you could see it go away again from one policy intervention. Really, very dramatic. But we saw the same thing over and over again with the footfall data. We just start seeing it go down. You get even within the footfall data, you see the fact that the high street suffers quite badly. Out of town places you can drive to do actually a bit better. So you guys start to get a sense of the economic switches that are going on, but also how people's behavior is changing. And it's noisy, but it gives you something, and it's infinitely better than waiting for CFAX to flick over. So we come an awful long way, and we're not going to go back. The second thing I think is going to come out today is around building capability. Although we talk about some of the products that have been produced, actually one thing that I took away from all the presentations was a huge amount of human capital development and infrastructure development, systems development that has gone over the last 18 months. Even if it's, the ONS presentations, Rian's one was really strong, and Emily, about, you know, their movement from, they began using Excel, by the end they've got a fully integrated R system. You know, they've done that with an SPSS middle bit. You know, that's a huge amount of kind of human capital and system development has gone on that can be used and leveraged into all kinds of other ways. And I think that's, again, something we need to kind of capture and cherish and kind of build off. I think admin data, again, has been another area where I think at the top of the day, Patrick Vallance talking about how, you know, things that were not possible because of rules were possible within a matter of 6 weeks under pressure of the pandemic. And, you know, the great power of linking admin data, I think, to improve public services and decision making will become much more apparent in the next few years. And I think the, you know, the IDP that Sam's looking after is just potentially a massive asset for the nation to kind of get that operational and people using it. Probably just two final pieces of kind of caution. One is there's a huge amount of labour, which is, sorry, it's huge amounts of data that we have generated, but to an extent, a lot of it's greenfield. For a new problem, we've been able to do new surveys, new methods. Lots of the data that we'll be exploiting, you know, for example, in the IDP, is often essentially legacy, and our legacy systems are not that great. And there will be, we need to not forget to invest in the, you know, overhauling those systems so that they can be used for the new kind of techniques and approaches that we want. And the final point is around, you know, we haven't talked much about theory in today, and I think there's an important point about having a kind of proper understanding of what your economic model is to inform both the data that you commission or you hunt down and then interpret it. You know, I think, you know, thinking at the moment, we're looking at issues around, for example, there's some of the labour supply issues. I think having a reasonable view about how your labour market operates should inform and be informed by the data, but we do need to, you know, make sure that we don't forget the role of economic theory in trying to understand what's going on in the economy.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think that's an excellent place to end, and there's the importance of theory. We needed theory a couple of generations ago from Richard Stone and others to try and understand the national accounting framework, and we're developing some more theory on how we might better measure other parts of the economy. And clearly things like the Dasgupta report on thinking hard about natural capital will drive us in other areas about not only understanding GDP as it currently is, but also developing broader measures of well-being that really can stand the test of time. And I think that's an incredibly important point. The theory there is to some extent developed in terms of shadow prices, but hasn't really been fully worked on. We've got a large range of questions coming in, so I think what I'll try and do is there's one in particular I'd like, if I may, everyone's response on, and perhaps we just do it in the order in which we spoke in the first instance. That'll then be Sam, John, and Michael, and then we'll take it from there in terms of as the questions come in and who's best placed to answer it. Is that okay with everyone? We have a question that came in very early from Louise. Seems to be some shyness in people identifying where they work, but that's okay, Louise. You can tell us if you like some other time. But Louise, thanks for your question. The question there is, are there specific skills or areas where you think we ought to be building capability within our organizations to help tackle these types of challenges in the future? And I also want to extend that a little bit, if I may, John, to your point that we need to make sure we don't unlearn what we've learned, and that the access to data is maintained. It doesn't become a crisis response, and then the state crawls back into its shell and stops sharing in the way that it has. Those are not your words, they're my words. But working at the National Institute, I can see that there's some potentiality of people saying, well, I can't give you that because that requires all kinds of GDPR or the types of regulations. But the problem is, if we want there to be greater public understanding, greater awareness, we have to decide perhaps on some different point of the trade-off between openness and guarding people's genuine right to privacy. So I think that's an important question, and certainly, John, with your background, you could help us on that. But perhaps if I may go in the first instance in the order Sam, John, and Mike to that question.
Oh, thank you. So on the skills, I mean, I think it's sort of been nailed by the fact that we're having this conference. It is that data literacy point. I think that's incredibly important. The ONS is rolling out a data science masterclass for the civil service. And I think, that is something that all permanent secretaries are supposed to be enrolling on over the next few weeks. And I think that is, when the civil service sort of gets permanent secretaries to do 8 hours of training in a sheep dip fashion, that's something that the government certainly thinks is an enormous priority. So I think the whole area around data literacy, data visualization, and data science is something that we need to get people comfortable with. The customers need to be comfortable as the experts are comfortable. And so I think that agenda is something that is going to be a focus certainly of government and the ONS going forward. On the sort of data privacy and data sharing question, I think this is absolutely crucial. We are not going to be able to have a system where every owner of data gets consulted on the sharing of that data with every user of the data in a world of an integrated data platform. We are going to have to move from an owner-led permission system to a sort of user accreditation system. And I think that's going to be actually a massive leap of faith for some owners of data, and we are going to have to work on that, giving every sort of safety reassurance in all those different aspects of safety that will be required to make this work. So a very insightful question, and something that we are thinking deeply about, but it is going to need to be quite a radical change to the way we work at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. John, if I may turn to you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so I think I would absolutely agree with Sam that we need to make sure that the average civil servant feels that being data literate is as important as being able to write a policy brief or being able to do whatever the sort of things that they would consider to be a core civil servant. You need to have a core understanding of data, and I think that the more we can show that that's important, and I think the data masterclass is a really good example of that. Is great. I think there's also, and I'm not going to let any civil servant off the hook in the sense it's the other side as well. I would really like the analysts to feel that they really understand what the implications of all this new data are for policy customers, and how that in actual fact is going to lead to some profound changes in how policy is done, and analysts need to be able to help with that. And I think that rather than simply saying, oh, I produce the data and then it's your issue, in actual fact, really bringing people together so that they both understand each other's problems will actually make this really beneficial. So I think everybody should have a little bit of good understanding, enough to have a proper conversation about what the other person is is their core day job that they have to worry about. So I think making sure that we have the specific skills on both sides is crucial. And I think there's a lot of really good people who have that already, but I think making that just the norm will be something that is really useful. I think on the sort of bringing together the data and how to make sure it doesn't lapse back, I think part of it is going to be a cultural shift of, well, we can do this now. How people challenging and saying, well, we did it before, why can't we do it now? And that can be very powerful. I think as Sam has said very eloquently about how we will have to change the model of how data is used, that's going to be highly important. From those outside, I think to my academic colleagues, I would challenge them that there are ways of making sure that data can be used carefully and with the right privacy controls in place, and that can be done in its sort of guaranteed fashion, and making sure that that is high up the agenda for research and implementation and use in practice has also got to be part of it, because we know that making sure that systems are in place all the way through from processes and practice in sort of the standard civil service way through to how we actually design our models in the first place, so that in actual fact it's much harder to break privacy controls. would be, is part of what we need to do too. So I think there's areas on all sides that need to come together to actually work out what kind of systems we want to have in place so that the data can be used in the most beneficial way. And also, what questions should we legitimately be asking, because they are the ones that really will be able to be answered without data being, the privacy and ethics being compromised. And which questions really should we say, in actual fact, we're not ready to answer those yet. We will get there, but we're not ready yet.
Thank you, John. Incredibly incisive and helpful comments. I particularly like the point about drawing on the understanding of those who put the data together. Something we do a lot in economics when we say we put the data together. Where are the problems in it before you start sort of thinking too much about it? And that's something we've all done earlier in our careers. Often go to primary sources and put that data together, and then we're in a really good position to guide people as to which bits are reliable and which bits aren't. And that's a very good point, but also one that's developmental for younger analysts to think that that's their responsibility as well. So very much good point. Mike, so I think you want to add to
Okay, so I think Patrick this morning made a point about customer awareness.
Yes.
And I think that's, that on the skill side, getting that demand right, a kind of sophisticated understanding from policy customers broadly, ministers downwards, I think is really important here. And I think things like the Data Masterclass actually are really good programs. And it's great that they're being kind of rolled and scaled across the service. I think there's something about like events like today. One of our objectives, as well as making sure that we don't go backwards from an event like today, was partly to share what's possible. What I think has been really great about the last 18 months in terms of data has been a number of the techniques and approaches that we've deployed are very accessible. They maybe 10 years ago, absolute bleeding edge, but now, as we heard from some of the presentations, these are relatively accessible tools and techniques. And so part of what we're trying to do is to show the thing, as GDS would say, but show that these techniques can be deployed by specialists, but relatively straightforwardly. And I think the more we can collectively as a community show what we've done and share what we've done, that's really important to kind of just build confidence and raise expectations. And then just the final thing around skills. I think John is right about analysts and kind of their training. And I think for the GES, when we're designing our own programs, so our own apprenticeship at Kent and our one at Queen Mary, we've now hard coded in modules that deal with essentially use of data science. So as well as kind of classic econometric type programs, but this kind of thing, because we recognise that it's what the standard looks like. I think we've got a way to go, because that will deal with our flow, and we have a stock. We need to think about how we can support our colleagues to become more confident data literate in these techniques. But I think that's the kind of profession, that's probably what we need to add.
Thank you, Mike. We've a nice point raised by Sanjeev Mahajan at ONS in the chat about data uncertainty. He likes the points we're making about data uncertainty. He's pointing towards some of the work done recently by ONS and ESCoE, looking at GDP data uncertainty, as well as trying to understand the extent to which the public currently understand simple economic terms like public debt, interest rates, inflation. And both areas, I think there is quite a program of research ongoing there. So I think I'll start with John. I'll sort of change the order a bit if I might. Have you any insights as to where that research might go and the extent to which that kind of work is being absorbed by the wider statistical community? Is there anything more we should be thinking of in that direction, John, given the comments that you made?
So I think that there's two sides to that. I think there is really how do we help everybody understand that data uncertainty is something that is there, and that is not something that we should be scared of, or something that should be removed and then discounted because it makes life harder. In actual fact, it often describes some of the essence of what's actually the biggest difficulties in the decisions that people have to make. And I think trying to communicate it in a way that captures it, that doesn't make more of it than it is, but does show that in actual fact there are difficulties and that the data is not perfect, and it could lead with different types of uncertainty, could lead to slightly different understandings of what is going on, is is part of what the next generation of data scientists and the next generation of people using data should be comfortable to do. But it is not easy. And I think we've got to be really clear that a good explanation of uncertainty is not something that is a bolt-on to something that people should just be able to do. It requires as much training and as much thinking about research as any other part of the data gathering process. That the dissemination of information is a vital part, but a specialist part in its own right. And I think there are centres, and we have the Winton Centre here in Cambridge, but there are centres across the country where they're trying to think about what are the best ways to highlight uncertainty and give it in a way that really doesn't predicate that this is the right or wrong answer, but simply informs people as to how to take that uncertainty into account and then build it into their decision making. And I think we need to be clear that uncertainty is something that is an inherent part of this new data generation, new data process. We will get different sources of data that tell us different things that are seemingly at odds, and that is not something that is, inherently means the data is wrong. It simply means that, in actual fact, there is some untold story that we're going to have to work through, and that we will never know the right answer before we actually have to make our decision. And helping people understand that and become comfortable with that's the environment we have to work in is something that's going to require a lot of work on lots of people's part. But then understanding that in actual fact that is where we are at.
Thank you, John. Yes, with all data and indeed with forecasts, the buyer needs to be aware, caveat emptor, and we need to explain to people the risks that there are. It's something that certainly macroeconomics goes on with all kinds of projections of risk to any particular forecast, scenarios attached to that as well. And as well as that, on statements about genuine uncertainty, things that we just may not know. And the interesting thing from the economist's perspective is that all of that then changes behavior to the extent to which if you're certainty equivalent as to the mapping of the data, then you'll make one set of decisions, but more that you crank up the possibility of different types of risks or indeed uncertainty, you'd almost immediately expect to see a different set of responses in the economy. And that's where actually it gets really important as well, not only in terms of communication, but in terms of final behavior. Does it drive precautionary savings or delays in investment or other things that actually materially matter for the state of the economy? So I couldn't agree more. Mike, could I ask you to sort of comment as well on
yeah, it's probably not the macro, but more I think the kind of treatment of uncertainty generally is something we need to be kind of more kind of transparent about. And I think some of the changes in areas like the Green Book help us, give us permission to do that more often. And so, I think there's, what we should be thinking about as kind of analytical leaders is how can we give permission to our colleagues so that they don't feel obliged to hit the point estimate, and to be confident about talking around that, and that's okay, and that's not a failure. And I think there's something for kind of all of us involved in this world to be kind of just to provide that level of assurance and air cover to allow our colleagues to do what needs to be done.
Yeah. It's difficult, isn't it? Because one of the criticisms we get as economists, I'm not talking about the National Institute, is when we provide confidence bands or risk estimates, then people will say, well, then anything goes. You're not saying anything because you're saying that this might happen, but a whole bunch of other things might happen, and I'm not sure what to do with it. And that's something we go back to John and both of your points. We need to work harder at explaining that we recognise these risks to any estimate that we have or any forecast, and we're trying to explain what might happen in the world in which something different happens to our point estimate. So it requires that kind of level of communication and involvement with the consumer of the analysis. It's incredibly interesting. Sam, is there anything you'd wish to add to that?
Yeah, I would just emphasize the point about different audiences and different users of statistics. I mean, the public, people make a big effort to understand things if it really matters to them and if it impacts on their life. And there is a sense in which GDP does not impact on people's lives. That's that famous quote about, is your GDP not mine, from the sort of Brexit conference. But you know, people understand interest rates, they understand inflation. They don't understand GDP, and you know, that's because it's a macro average that doesn't mean much to them. So I think, you know, what we've seen in the pandemic, though, is that, you know, there's quite a lot of people who can now explain what an exponential rise is. I mean, whoever thought that would happen? But it does matter to them because they're worried about assessing the risk in quite a sophisticated way. So, you know, I think the communicating uncertainty is incredibly important to us all in the profession, and we should work hard at being better at this. But we have to recognise that you need to stratify your user group to understand how to communicate that without just making people think, well, what's the point? You know, they're telling me one thing and then telling me to ignore it. What am I supposed to make of that? So, you know, I think we need to be quite sophisticated about our different audiences. Just a short anecdote. I can remember the Bank of England tried really hard with its GDP fan charts to start with, and I think I'm back in 2005 now, let's say, in the Treasury, and the Bank of England would send the fan charts, and they sort of like didn't put the midpoint in because that was the whole point, right? We just used to get a ruler and a pencil out and work out what the midpoint was, and then stick that in the briefing. So, you know, there's you can try anyway. No, I think, but there are things, if you think about communication of financial instruments, for example, where, you know, there was a massive increase in explaining interest rates to people, you know, warnings about returns going up as well as down, and the small print, things like that. You know, it can be done, but it is a massive effort, and I think you can only hope to engage people on things that matter to them.
Thank you very much, Sam. I'm going to turn now to a question I'll put to Mike, because it's from one of your colleagues, Ian Mitchell, Head of Modelling Integrity at BEIS. Clearly, you'll have to take him out for a coffee later this week as well, looking at this question to follow up. But the question is, the benefits of sharing data has been a recurring theme today. What can we do across the professions in the analysis function? That sounds a bit internal to BEIS, but I think I'll take it as a broader statement about profession in general to help this happen, sharing data. I think we've touched upon this question, but how can we do an even better job?
So I think I'm probably going to throw this one to Sam, because this is really about the integrated data platform. And I think what we've seen over the, you know, we have over time done some quite good data linking work. You know, probably the most visible one people be aware of would be the longitudinal educational outcomes database that DFE has, which obviously spices together HMRC, DWP, and BFE data, which is a tremendous piece of work, and shows the power of, you know, the insights you can generate when you put all this together, and also how a lot of kind of policy discussion about A being better than B, then better than C, without that suddenly gets solved because you actually have the data. You know, so a lot of things that we thought about education have kind of melted away because we have the data. We know what the answer is. So I think that's kind of where you want to get to. That is difficult, and I think what Sam and Ian have been doing over the last 18 months, and, you know, onward with the IDP, is really trying to create a safe space that allows more Leos or Leo variants to be put together, so that we can start generating this kind of insight. But it is, you know, it's not straightforward. I'm sure Sam will tell me how not straightforward it is.
No, look, it is hard. I think you've put that really well. I mean, I would just add a couple of things. You know, we need to sort of tell stories, like your one about the Leo data. We've got another one we can tell on towns and high streets of data linkage. There's the great stories from COVID. I think Sir Ian was talking about those this morning, about, you know, linking death rates and linking the different outcomes, health outcomes of COVID for different ethnicities, etc. And these are all things that couldn't be done without data linking. So we need to enthuse people with stories about how incredibly important this is, and how you know, it changes the sum of human knowledge, and benefits sort of the economy and society. So we kind of need we need those stories. We also need to kind of prize more of the data that we own out of different departments, and knowing it's there is important. So my kind of shout out to all the economists in the different departments is get to know your data asset, think about it innovatively, and then think about sharing it with colleagues in the ONS, and come and start tackling the early issues that you might encounter about the sharing, because knowing what you've got and its potential is a really important first step. And I don't even think we're at that stage yet. I mean, one of the questions I've had when I've sort of challenged people on sharing their data is, what's the cashable saving from sharing the data? Now, that's a really hard question to answer, and I've gone away to think about that. But this is one of the sort of questions that we're going to meet in the resistance to data sharing, because when people are going to take the risk of sharing data and all the security and reputational risk that entails, they are going to need to be enthused and reassured and understand the potential that they've got there. Thank you.
John, is there anything you want to add to this important question?
I think only briefly to say that I think really support Sam in saying that you just need to know what's there before you can link it together. And I think that really being able to understand from across all the analytical professions. So I think that one of the really nice things about having all the different types of analysts is that they think about things in slightly different ways. And therefore they can come up with different ways of linking together data, or different data sources that might actually help address questions that any individual sort of analytical profession may not know how to do on their own. And I think really the sort of the communication between analysts and others, but to think of what kind of questions can we now answer that we couldn't even think of answering before, couldn't even ask before. But now, because we've got this opportunity, what can we do? And I think doing that would be, is going to be one of the major advantages of linking all this data together.
Can I sort of ask a follow-up, listening to you all? I mean, how do we ensure that we do sort of, talk to a very broad range of people who might have ideas as to the things that we might do? I absolutely sense how busy everyone in government is. Anyone in academia, such as yourself, John, has enormous workload, also managing teaching under these difficult circumstances. Well, there's just so much going on. And how do we absolutely capture these ideas and move it forward in a way that it doesn't fall between stools and doesn't get lost with the day-to-day, the month-to-month pressures of crisis management, which is what so much, unfortunately, government is about? Do we need specific institutions? Do we need a specific minister in charge? How do we make sure this goodwill that I'm sensing from all three of you today, and a large degree of concordance, actually carries through into better use of data, better connections in data, and ultimately better policy answers? One brief comment, if I may. We have a lot of discussions in and around in the economist community about the use of data to answer particular questions, and it's nearly always put the case that the UK stands very far behind many other advanced economies, whether it's the Scandinavians or the Americans, for example. Firm level data is hard to connect across the board, and that gives us, relatively compared to other advanced economies, little understanding of the constraints they may face, either in terms of debt or planning that they have, or firm births, and where they might go in terms of productivity at some point in the future. There seems to be things missing in the way it all gets connected. What you've got often, it seems to me, and I don't work in this field, and I apologize to anyone if I get this wrong, but there seems to me to be bespoke data sets created time and time again, rather than an obvious interrogation of the whole data set that could be created. Now, that might require ultimately some institutional device to make sure that happens. That could be right, could be wrong, but how do we get to the next step? John, perhaps first, and then Mike.
I mean, I think I would have two things here. I would say that there's always got to be a driving force behind why you would want to do this. And I think COVID has demonstrated that if you have something as big as COVID, then you need to have data available. There were questions that needed to be answered, and suddenly things fell away that were there before. COVID is, a massive example in the sense of something like that. But there are many, many other examples where it is a priority, and you need to think about how you can use that priority to link things together that need to be linked together. So I think the community as a whole has to use the opportunities it has for, on it in front of it to think creatively as to how to do that. I think it's probably not going to happen if you just say across the board, well, of course we need to link more data, because everybody go, oh, yes, of course, that's great, and then they go off and do whatever they need to do today. But if today's problem can be solved by linking data, then that's going to be much more. That's going to drive things much quicker. But then the flip side of that is you actually then need to, and I think we've heard some great examples already. We need to show the successes and why it made a difference. I think if you can say to ministers, to senior officials, to the general public, we link this data together and look what happened. And that then really gives an imperative. Well, if you've done it there, and I think, I can see that you're now saying that if I link this data together there, that's going to also help. It just becomes self-perpetuating. And the really good thing about sort of COVID is that it's given us a number of sets of examples of why it's really worked and what's really happened. It's also helped other people come out of the sort of the shadows to say, in actual fact, we did something like that, and here's another example, and here's another example, and here's another example. And as that happens, I think that there will be a continued sort of questioning of, well, have you linked all the data together to solve this problem? And once people start asking that question, then you're away. We're not there yet. We're absolutely not there yet. But that's where you want to get to, is that people believe that data linkage is a standard thing that should happen. And if we get there, then I think we'll be in a much better state.
That's a very positive and reassuring viewpoint. Mike, and then Sam, do you have any additional points? And then I'll give you 30 seconds to wrap up.
Look, I mean, I think completely agree with John in terms of how this plays out. I think there are good examples, and I think we get more good examples like every week. So I mean, both Sam and Ian talked about the levelling up work. We've got stuff going on net zero, identifying kind of which houses are simultaneously fuel poor and energy efficient. So energy inefficient. So where you could basically get a carbon and welfare benefit by supporting. There's lots of these projects around. I think there's an issue about scale and coherence, and that's why I think the integrated data platform initiative is really good, because that's potentially the place where this all comes together and starts getting kind of scaled and systematized.
Sam.
I don't think I've got a huge amount to add. I just, it's about bringing together communities of interest, isn't it? I mean, I think ESCoE, is a great place to, bring together the community of analysis, across all its sort of broad areas of, professionalism, and to innovate around this subject. So, ESCoE is a great linchpin for this. I think in government, I mean, I'm really optimistic about the appetite of ministers to push forward this agenda. I don't think that is an issue at all. I think the caution lies in the kind of civil service system, if I'm honest. And I think we need to crack some of the deep-rooted caution around sharing data, and it is about, rightly, the fact that a lot of our institutions have been set up to absolutely preserve the anonymity and confidentiality of the data that we are now saying, bring it along, guys. We'll link it with all this other data, and then we'll let the whole world play around with it. So it's not easy. It's not an easy sell to some of our colleagues, but it's not a governmental leadership question at all. It is setting up the reassurances on so many different layers that it will be required when institutionally it's all been about protection up until now. So it is very countercultural, but that is setting up the big vision of potential, I think.
Okay, well, that's again a very pleasing vision. I'm not a cynic particularly, but I would like to see and hope that politicians are able to carry through that in a consistent manner. One of the failings, it seems to me, as an economist looking at policy making in this country over the long run, is that often there are initiatives that for some reason or other fall by the wayside, and that's where institutional reform and capability tends to matter. I don't doubt our commitment to these questions this afternoon, but I think there may need to be some extra institution capability or building alongside some of this, and perhaps ESCoE is also the answer. Naturally, as the host of ESCoE, I'm very pleased to hear that, but I think there is always more work involved in these things. That hour has absolutely flown by. I've learned so much. I thank you very much, John, Mike and Sam. I ought to give you each perhaps a sentence to finish off, and then I'll say goodbye to everyone, but I can see most of our audience are still with us. So perhaps I could just go in reverse order for just a brief, any final comment you may want to make, Mike, John, and then Sam.
No going back.
Like it. John?
I can't beat it. That's exactly right. We're at such a good point. We can be optimistic for the future, but only if we keep going.
Wonderful. Sam?
Bring your data to the ONS.
Well, there are three very good messages, and in terms of not going back and optimistic for the future, I know what I'll be doing 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, so I hope you'll all be doing the same. Let's see where we are. Hopefully we'll be at another match on Sunday, but who knows? There's all kinds of things to follow there, but I've really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. Sam Beckett, Second Permanent Secretary of ONS, Mike Keoghan, Chief Economic Advisor at BEIS, and John Aston, Harding Professor of Public Understanding Statistics at the University of Cambridge. Thank you very much, so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for contributing to what has been an excellent day. Thanks to our colleagues at BEIS, ESCoE, my colleagues at NIESR for helping organise this event. I should say we should do more of them, but let's try to do these in person. I must confess, it's been a wonderful afternoon, but I am suffering from Zoom fatigue, big time. I just need to start meeting people. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you all very soon. Goodbye.